Marcus mopped the same hallway every dawn, sharing coffee with the frail old man who waited by the elevator. But when the Vampire King swept through those doors flanked by four stone-faced bodyguards, Marcus watched his gentle friend straighten into someone who made ancient predators kneel. Marcus stepped into the university maintenance basement at exactly 4:30 a.m., his keyring jangling against the silence that wrapped around the empty building like a familiar blanket. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life overhead, casting their harsh white glow across concrete walls lined with pipes and electrical panels. Steam rose from his travel mug of black coffee, the bitter scent mixing with the basement's perpetual smell of cleaning chemicals and old paper. He had walked these same corridors for 3 years, knew every creaking floorboard and temperamental light switch, but tonight something felt different. The elevator shaft echoed with a sound that might have been breathing, and when he rounded the corner toward the janitor's closet, Theodore was already there. The old man sat hunched on the metal folding chair Marcus had left out for him months ago, his paper-thin hands wrapped around a thermos that never seemed to hold enough warmth. Theodore's sharp, too bright eyes tracked Marcus's movement with the precision of someone accustomed to measuring threats and opportunities in split seconds. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. His clothes were expensive but worn. A wool coat that had seen better decades and leather shoes polished to hide their age. The medication bottles in his coat pocket rattled softly when he shifted, though Marcus had noticed long ago that none of them bore pharmacy labels. Theodore had simply appeared one morning 6 months earlier, frail and lost, speaking with the kind of formal courtesy that belonged to a different century. Marcus had offered coffee and a place to sit, expecting the old man to disappear by the next day. Instead, Theodore had become part of the routine, arriving before dawn to share stories that contained too many specific details about historical events and people who should have been distant memories. He spoke of debts that compound over centuries and obligations that bind the powerful to those they had forgotten. Checking his antique pocket watch with the obsessive precision of someone counting down to an appointment he both expected and dreaded. Marcus poured coffee into a second mug he had started bringing, the ceramic warming his palms as he settled into the plastic chair across from Theodore. The old man accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, his fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the handle. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two unlikely companions sharing warmth in the basement's perpetual chill. Theodore's presence had become something Marcus looked forward to, a reminder that even in his solitary work, he could offer small kindnesses that mattered to someone. The old man never asked for food, but Marcus had taken to bringing extra sandwiches, watching Theodore's careful pride give way to grateful acceptance when hunger overrode dignity. There was something noble about the way Theodore held himself, even in his obvious poverty, as if he had once commanded respect and was slowly learning to live without it. His stories meandered through decades with the casual authority of lived experience, mentioning historical figures by their first names and describing long-gone places with the vivid detail of recent memory. Marcus had stopped questioning the impossible specificity of Theodore's tales, instead finding comfort in the old man's voice and the way their morning ritual gave structure to the empty hours before the university came alive. The basement felt warmer with Theodore in it, less like a hiding place and more like a sanctuary where two people could acknowledge each other's loneliness without judgment or expectation. Theodore's gratitude was genuine but guarded, as if kindness was both desperately needed and inherently dangerous, a gift that came with prices he had learned to calculate in advance. Marcus helped him sort his unmarked medications each morning, noting that Theodore always knew exactly which pills to take despite their identical appearance, and that his hands steadied considerably after the small white tablets dissolved under his tongue. The old man's accent carried traces of places Marcus couldn't identify, a cosmopolitan blend that suggested extensive travel or perhaps origins in countries that no longer existed under their original names. When Theodore spoke of waiting for someone, his voice carried the weight of certainty rather than hope, as if the reunion was inevitable rather than desired. This morning, Theodore accepted his coffee with unusual distraction, his bright eyes darting toward the elevator shaft as if tracking sounds Marcus couldn't hear. His antique pocket watch emerged from his vest more frequently than usual, its ornate silver case catching the fluorescent light as he checked the time with increasing urgency. The medication bottles in his coat pocket remained untouched, forgotten in whatever internal calculation was consuming his attention. Marcus found himself studying Theodore's face more closely, noting how the old man's apparent frailty seemed to shift and change depending on his posture and expression, sometimes revealing glimpses of steel beneath the vulnerable exterior. The stories Theodore told this morning carried darker undertones than usual, references to reckonings and consequences, to powerful people who collected debts across generations and never forgot perceived slights. His formal courtesy took on an edge that suggested familiarity with violence and authority, the kind of careful politeness that served as both shield and weapon in dangerous company. Marcus offered food as he always did, unwrapping a sandwich and placing it within Theodore's reach, but the old man barely acknowledged the gesture. Instead, Theodore's attention remained fixed on sounds only he could perceive, his breathing shallow and controlled in a way that reminded Marcus of prey animals sensing approaching predators. The basement's familiar shadows seemed deeper this morning, stretching longer beneath the fluorescent lights, and the building's usual settling sounds carried an ominous quality that made Marcus's shoulders tense. Theodore's grip on his coffee mug tightened until his knuckles showed white against his translucent skin, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a resonance that hadn't been there moments before. Marcus realized he had never heard Theodore's full voice before, only the whispered fragments of someone conserving strength or hiding power, and the revelation sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. The old man's two bright eyes met his directly for the first time, and Marcus saw intelligence there that was both ancient and calculating, the kind of awareness that belonged to someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives and nations. Theodore's mouth opened as if to explain or apologize, but the words died unspoken as his entire body went rigid with listening. Marcus strained to hear what had captured Theodore's attention so completely, but the basement yielded only its usual symphony of mechanical sounds and distant settling. Theodore's antique pocket watch snapped closed with a definitive click that sounded like a door slamming shut, and when he looked at Marcus again, his expression carried the weight of someone delivering news that would change everything. His paper-thin hands trembled, not with age or illness now, but with something that might have been fear, or anticipation, or both, and his formal courtesy cracked just enough to reveal genuine regret. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they carried across the basement's silence with perfect clarity, each syllable dropping like a stone into still water. "They've found me." Heavy footsteps echoed through the building above them, each step deliberate and measured, the kind of purposeful stride that belonged to people accustomed to having doors opened before they could knock. Marcus felt Theodore's tension like a physical presence, the old man's careful composure finally cracking to reveal something that might have been relief or terror or both. The fluorescent lights flickered, as if responding to some electromagnetic disturbance, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Theodore rose from his chair with fluid grace that bore no resemblance to the careful movements of a frail elderly man, his spine straightening and his shoulders squaring as if invisible armor was settling into place. The transformation was so complete that Marcus barely recognized him, the vulnerability and grateful dependence falling away like discarded costume pieces. Theodore's sharp eyes now blazed with authority that made the basement's harsh lighting seem dim by comparison, and his voice when he spoke carried the resonance of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. 4 imposing figures in dark suits swept through the university's main entrance, their synchronized movements speaking of military precision and shared purpose. They moved through the building with the confidence of people who had memorized every floor plan and exit route, their footsteps coordinated like a drumbeat that grew louder as they approached the basement level. Marcus felt the temperature drop several degrees as they descended, each breath visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the shadows around the elevator shaft seemed to deepen and writhe with unnatural life. The lead figure emerged first, tall and pale with the kind of austere beauty that belonged to classical sculptures, his presence radiating authority that made the basement's concrete walls seem inadequate to contain him. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, and his movements carried the predatory grace of someone who had never known doubt or hesitation in any decision that mattered. When his eyes found Theodore, they carried recognition and something that might have been respect or fear, emotions that seemed foreign to features carved from marble and moonlight. Behind him came 3 others, each carrying themselves with the same lethal poise, their faces masks of professional composure that couldn't quite hide their wariness. They arranged themselves in a precise formation that spoke of years of practice, creating clear sight lines while maintaining defensive positions that could shift to offense in heartbeats. Marcus found himself pressed against the basement wall, forgotten in the sudden tension that crackled between Theodore and the newcomers like electricity seeking ground. The pale leader's gaze swept the basement with the calculating precision of someone cataloging weapons and weaknesses, noting every detail that might prove relevant in negotiations or combat. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction and the subtle accent of places that predated modern geography. His words hit the basement silence like formal declarations, each syllable chosen for maximum impact and minimum ambiguity. The other 3 figures moved with synchronized precision, taking positions that transformed the humble basement into something resembling a throne room or a court of final judgment. Marcus realized he was witnessing a ceremony governed by rules he didn't understand, protocols that predated any human institution and carried consequences that extended far beyond simple social courtesy. Theodore stood at the center of this supernatural attention with complete composure, no longer the grateful old man who had shared coffee and stories, but something else entirely, something that commanded respect from beings who looked as if they had never bowed to anyone. The pale leader's next words shattered Marcus's understanding of the world as completely as breaking glass, revealing depths of reality he had never suspected and hierarchies that stretched back through centuries of hidden history. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the Vampire King and his 3 companions dropped to one knee before Theodore, their synchronized movement transforming the basement into something that felt like a cathedral or a courtroom where ultimate verdicts were delivered. "Your Majesty," the Vampire King said to Theodore, his marble features expressing deference that seemed carved from centuries of protocol and respect. Theodore's response came in a voice that carried the resonance of absolute authority tempered by genuine weariness, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had spent lifetimes learning the weight that language could bear. "Rise, Constantine. We have much to discuss and little time." Marcus pressed himself harder against the concrete wall, his coffee mug forgotten in hands that suddenly seemed to belong to someone else, as the impossible became undeniable and his quiet morning routine shattered into fragments that could never be reassembled. The shadows in the basement shifted and deepened, as if responding to the presence of beings whose very existence bent reality around them, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with increasing urgency as they struggled to illuminate creatures who seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Constantin rose with fluid grace, his pale features arranging themselves into expressions of concern and carefully controlled urgency, while his 3 companions maintained their positions like an honor guard attending a meeting of powers that shaped nations and centuries. Theodore's transformation was complete now, the frail old man entirely gone, replaced by someone whose presence filled the basement with authority that made the concrete walls seem like palace chambers and the humble chairs like thrones of state. His sharp eyes found Marcus against the wall and softened with genuine regret, acknowledging that their simple friendship had become something far more complicated and dangerous than either of them had intended. The weight of centuries pressed down on the basement as ancient hierarchies reasserted themselves, and Marcus understood that he had stumbled into a world where morning coffee shared with a lonely old man was actually morning coffee shared with someone who had once ruled creatures that could reshape reality with their will. Constantine's gaze followed Theodore's to find Marcus, and in those marble features, Marcus saw calculation and assessment, the kind of predatory evaluation that weighed threats and assets with equal precision. The basement's familiar comfort evaporated entirely, replaced by the electric tension of a moment when ordinary human life intersected with forces that operated by rules written in blood and honored across centuries. Theodore's voice when he addressed Marcus carried both affection and apology, acknowledging that their quiet sanctuary had become ground zero for conflicts that predated human civilization and would outlast any resolution they might reach. My dear friend, I'm afraid our morning coffee ritual must evolve. The university basement conference room had been hastily converted into something resembling a war council, its utilitarian furniture pushed aside to make space for maps and documents that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Morning sunshine filtered through the high windows, casting long rectangles of gold across concrete floors that had never hosted discussions of supernatural politics and ancient territorial disputes. Marcus sat in a metal folding chair that felt increasingly inadequate as Theodore revealed the scope of his true identity, each detail reshaping not just his understanding of his friend, but his entire conception of what was possible in the world. Theodore moved around the improvised meeting space with authority that transformed the humble basement into something resembling a command center, his frail disguise completely abandoned in favor of bearing that spoke of centuries spent making decisions that affected nations and species. His voice carried the weight of lived history as he explained his exile from power, his 3 years of hiding, and his desperate need for the one thing Marcus had offered without thought or expectation: simple human companionship. Constantine arranged his papers with the precision of someone accustomed to managing complex political situations, but his marble features betrayed concern that went beyond mere diplomatic protocol. The approaching threat he described carried implications that stretched far beyond vampire politics, encompassing ancient powers that viewed the New World as territory to be reclaimed and modern supernatural communities as obstacles to be eliminated. Marcus learned that he had been Theodore's only sustained human contact during 3 years of exile, serving as an anchor to humanity that had kept the former emperor from disappearing entirely into the bitter isolation of supernatural politics. The revelation came with weight that made his simple acts of kindness feel simultaneously more precious and more dangerous. Gestures of basic human decency that had unknowingly sustained someone capable of reshaping the balance of power across continents. Theodore's gratitude was genuine and profound, but it carried the burden of involving an innocent person in conflicts that could destroy everything Marcus had ever known or cared about. His protective instincts warred with practical necessity, as Constantine's advisors argued that human involvement represented security risks that could compromise centuries of carefully maintained secrecy. The musty basement air grew thick with supernatural scents of old leather and polished metal, as more documents emerged from briefcases that seemed larger inside than their external dimensions could possibly accommodate. Marcus's human heartbeat sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that followed each revelation, a rhythmic reminder of his mortality among beings who measured their lives in centuries rather than decades. The basement's concrete walls seemed to pulse with tension as Theodore refused to negotiate any assistance without guarantees of Marcus's safety, his former imperial authority reasserting itself in ways that brooked no argument or compromise. Constantine's advisors spoke in rapid, formal language that carried undertones of languages that predated Latin, their words heavy with legal and mystical implications that Marcus could sense rather than understand. The concept of a blood pact emerged from their discussions like a lifeline thrown across an abyss, a ritual bond that could provide supernatural protection, but at costs that none of them seemed willing to fully articulate. Theodore's past sins remained unspecified, but clearly weighed heavily on his conscience, driving his determination to protect the one person who had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. The approaching ancients represented something beyond mere political opposition, their power rooted in ages when humanity existed at the sufferance of beings who viewed mortal life as a resource to be managed rather than respected. Marcus found himself caught between his loyalty to Theodore and his growing understanding of the magnitude of forces gathering around them, supernatural politics that could crush human civilization as an incidental consequence of their conflicts. The basement's fluorescent lights buzzed with increasing intensity, as if responding to the supernatural energies gathering in the small space, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Constantine's warning about the ancients' treatment of humans who knew too much carried implications that made Marcus's mundane concerns about work schedules and utility bills seem absurdly trivial by comparison. Theodore's insistence on Marcus's protection became the foundation for all other negotiations, transforming a simple friendship into a diplomatic necessity that could determine the outcome of supernatural conflicts spanning continents. The weight of secrets settled around Marcus like a heavy cloak, the knowledge that his quiet life was over and could never be reclaimed, regardless of whatever protections might be negotiated or rituals performed. Constantine's eventual agreement to protect Marcus came with warnings that carried the force of absolute certainty, acknowledging that ancient powers showed no mercy to humans who stumbled into their carefully guarded mysteries. "The ancients show no mercy to humans who know our secrets," Constantine said, his marble features expressing regret that seemed genuine despite his inhuman nature. Theodore's hidden apartment above the antique shop revealed the true scope of his long existence. Centuries of accumulated memories and artifacts, arranged with the careful precision of someone who had learned to carry his entire world in portable form. Ancient books crumbled at Marcus's touch, their pages yellow with age and heavy with knowledge that predated human civilization, while Theodore moved through the space with inhuman grace that he no longer bothered to conceal. The afternoon light streaming through tall windows illuminated dust motes that seemed to dance with their own purpose, and Marcus realized he was breathing air that had been shaped by centuries of supernatural presence. Theodore's explanation of vampire hierarchy unfolded like a map of invisible nations, territories marked by blood debts and ancient obligations that governed interactions across species and continents. The concept of blood debts carried weight that went beyond simple financial transactions, encompassing spiritual and mystical obligations that could bind beings across centuries and compel actions that defied rational self-interest. Marcus learned about the exile that had stripped Theodore of his imperial authority, political maneuvering and personal failures that had cost him everything except the stubborn conviction that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Theodore's regret over past decisions colored every explanation, the weight of 6 centuries of leadership culminating in failures that had driven him to seek anonymous refuge among humans who couldn't recognize what he had once been. The supernatural survival skills Theodore began teaching carried implications that made Marcus understand how completely his old life had ended. Marcus continued learning that every shadow might conceal watchers, and every stranger could represent dangers that operated by rules humanity had never imagined. The silver blade Theodore insisted he carry felt heavier than its actual weight, a tangible reminder that his simple acts of kindness had drawn him into conflicts where violence remained the final arbiter of disputes that diplomacy couldn't resolve. Constantine's intelligence network painted a picture of supernatural forces mobilizing across the eastern seaboard, ancient powers that viewed American territories as rightfully theirs, and modern vampire communities as usurpers to be eliminated or subordinated. The time pressure mounted with each report, supernatural creatures positioning themselves for conflicts that could reshape the hidden world, while Marcus struggled to absorb the weight of secrets that could destroy his sanity if he dwelt too long on their implications. Theodore's tactical mind reasserted itself as the afternoon wore on, his imperial training overriding years of careful retirement as he began calculating advantages and weaknesses in upcoming confrontations. The growing father-son dynamic between them felt both natural and terrifying, Marcus recognizing that he had found family precisely when that connection might prove fatal to them both. Theodore's apartment held layers of history that spoke to loves and losses spanning centuries, photographs and mementos from eras when vampires had walked more openly among humans who accepted their presence as part of the natural order. The weight of Theodore's long existence pressed down on the small space, making Marcus acutely aware of his own mortality and the brief span of years that had brought them together. Ancient artifacts lined shelves with the casual arrangement of someone who had accumulated treasures across lifetimes, but valued them mainly as reminders of moments when beauty had triumphed over the constant political machinations that dominated supernatural existence. Theodore's teaching carried the urgency of someone trying to compress centuries of hard-won knowledge into hours of instruction. His patience with Marcus's questions revealing depths of affection that made their friendship feel both precious and doomed. The concept of human retainers emerged as a formal recognition of bonds that had always existed between supernatural powers and the mortals who served them. But Theodore's relationship with Marcus transcended such simple categories. Their connection had grown from mutual loneliness and daily kindness rather than oaths of service or mystical compulsions, making it both stronger and more vulnerable than relationships governed by ancient law. The blood pact ritual represented a way to formalize protections that emotional bonds couldn't guarantee, supernatural law that would recognize Marcus's right to Theodore's protection regardless of political pressures or tactical necessities. The concept carried implications that made Marcus's head spin, mystical connections that would bind their life forces together in ways that could enhance both their abilities and their vulnerabilities. Theodore's explanations grew increasingly urgent as shadows lengthened outside the apartment windows, time running out for decisions that could never be undone or reconsidered once ancient powers arrived to settle accounts that had been accumulating for centuries. The message written in blood arrived as the sun touched the horizon, its crimson letters seeming to pulse with their own heartbeat as Theodore read words that had been penned with substances that carried mystical as well as symbolic weight. The ancients request an audience. Sunset, come alone. Constantine's stronghold occupied a repurposed cathedral whose soaring architecture had been adapted to serve supernatural rather than divine purposes. Its stained glass windows casting colored light across stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of worship and more recent decades of political maneuvering. Marcus felt dwarfed by the vaulted ceilings that seemed designed to remind visitors of powers that transcended human understanding, whether divine or supernatural, making little difference to mortals caught between forces they could barely comprehend. The blood-pact ritual required preparation that transformed the cathedral's nave into something resembling an operating theater, crossed with an ancient temple, ceremonial implements arranged with precision that spoke to consequences extending far beyond the physical plane. Theodore's insistence on completing the ritual before facing the ancients carried weight that overrode all other considerations, his determination to protect Marcus taking precedence over tactical advantages or diplomatic necessities. The ceremony itself began with invocations in languages that predated recorded history, words that seemed to resonate through the cathedral's stone walls and awaken echoes that had slept since the building's consecration centuries earlier. Marcus felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him as he knelt before altars that had been hastily rearranged to serve purposes their original builders never could have imagined. The metallic taste of blood shared between them carried implications that went beyond simple symbolic gestures, mystical connections forming in real time as ancient words bound their life forces together in ways that would persist regardless of distance or circumstance. Silver light emanated from ceremonial blades that had been forged for purposes that transcended mere metalwork, their edges sharp enough to cut through reality itself and draw forth essences that normally remained hidden within flesh and bone. Marcus's enhanced senses suddenly picked up supernatural presences throughout the cathedral and beyond, his awareness expanding to encompass layers of reality that had always existed just beyond human perception. The ritual created an empathic link that let him feel Theodore's emotions as clearly as his own, the former emperor's relief and terror intermingling with determination that carried the weight of centuries of accumulated regret. Other supernatural creatures began converging on the cathedral as the ceremony concluded, drawn by mystical energies that announced the formation of a blood pact to every sensitive within miles of the building. The pact's completion transformed Marcus from innocent bystander to active participant in supernatural politics, his life force now bound to Theodore's in ways that made him both more protected and more vulnerable than any normal human could imagine. Constantine's seers reported the ancient's location with precision that spoke to intelligence networks spanning centuries, their takeover of the Chrysler Building representing both practical headquarters and symbolic statement about their intentions regarding American supernatural communities. The ritual's magic attracted unwanted attention from creatures throughout the city, supernatural entities whose curiosity about the first successful blood pact in centuries could prove as dangerous as outright hostility. Theodore's emotional vulnerability during the ceremony revealed depths of affection that made their bond feel simultaneously more precious and more terrifying. Love that transcended species differences, but came with costs that could destroy everything they hoped to protect. Constantine's grudging respect for Marcus's courage carried implications about future relationships between human and supernatural communities, recognition that mortals could be partners rather than merely subjects in conflicts that shaped the hidden world. The empathic link between Marcus and Theodore began transmitting emotions and sensations that made it impossible to ignore the magnitude of forces gathering around them, ancient powers whose very presence distorted reality in ways that human consciousness struggled to process. The ritual's conclusion left Marcus gasping as his awareness expanded to encompass supernatural presences throughout Manhattan, creatures that had always existed just beyond human perception, now visible as clearly as buildings or traffic lights. There are so many of them. They're everywhere. Marcus struggled with his enhanced senses as supernatural creatures throughout New York City became visible to him, their forms overlapping with ordinary reality, like double-exposed photographs that revealed hidden layers of existence. Constantine's network reported werewolf packs gathering in Central Park, while Fey courts convened in subway tunnels that existed in spaces between normal geography, their politics as complex and dangerous as anything the vampires might devise. Theodore prepared for the approaching confrontation while trying to shield Marcus from the worst of their linked emotions, the empathic connection carrying currents of fear and determination that threatened to overwhelm human consciousness, unprepared for such intensity. The ancients sent an emissary whose appearance shattered Marcus's remaining assumptions about supernatural nature, a child vampire whose innocent features concealed centuries of accumulated malice and wisdom that predated human civilization. Her too sweet scent of old blood and forgotten flowers filled the cathedral with perfume that spoke to appetites and hungers that normal human experience couldn't encompass. The supernatural community divided into factions as word spread about the approaching confrontation, some creatures favoring appeasement, while others advocated for war that could expose their hidden world to human attention with catastrophic results for both species. Constantine's weight of leadership became visible in the way his marble features reflected responsibility for decisions that could determine the survival of supernatural communities across the entire continent. The child emissary's unsettling blend of innocence and ancient malice made every word carry implications that extended far beyond simple diplomatic protocol, her presence transforming negotiations into psychological warfare where every gesture held multiple meanings. The city's supernatural layer became visible to Marcus as shadows that moved wrong and reflections that didn't match their sources. Sounds only his enhanced hearing could detect, creating a symphony of hidden activity that had always surrounded human existence. Other supernatural creatures began responding to the ancient's presence with territorial displays and alliance negotiations that could reshape the balance of power regardless of whatever immediate conflicts might emerge from the confrontation. Theodore's tactical mind reasserted itself as reports arrived describing supernatural mobilization across the eastern seaboard, ancient powers calling in debts and obligations that had accumulated across centuries of carefully maintained relationships. The child vampire's direct gaze at Marcus carried assessment that made him understand his transformation from innocent bystander to strategic asset in conflicts whose scope extended far beyond personal relationships or simple territorial disputes. Constantine's fears about facing the ancients became visible in micro-expressions that his marble features couldn't entirely conceal. Recognition that diplomatic solutions might prove inadequate against powers that viewed negotiation as weakness rather than wisdom. References to Theodore's great betrayal remained cryptic, but clearly carried weight that influenced every decision and calculation. Past actions that continued generating consequences across decades of exile and attempted anonymity. The ancients' interest in more than just Theodore became apparent through hints and implications that suggested their arrival represented opportunity rather than simple punishment, political maneuvering that encompassed goals extending far beyond settling old scores. Marcus learned to function with supernatural awareness, while the city around him revealed layers of activity that had always existed just beyond human perception. Creatures whose presence shaped events in ways that mortal politics and economics never acknowledged. The supernatural community's response to the ancients, divided along lines that reflected centuries of accumulated tensions and unresolved disputes, alliances forming and dissolving based on calculations that weighed survival against honor. Time pressure mounted with each report describing additional supernatural arrivals, the approaching confrontation becoming inevitable regardless of whatever diplomatic solutions might be attempted or concessions offered. The child emissary's final words carried implications that transformed the entire situation from political negotiation to personal threat, her innocent features expressing certainty about outcomes that hadn't yet been determined through any process Marcus could understand. The ancients are curious about your pet human, Theodoric. They have such interesting plans for him. The Chrysler Building's Art Deco lobby had been transformed into something resembling a supernatural court, where ancient powers held audiences that could determine the fate of entire communities. Its geometric patterns seeming to pulse with their own rhythm as shadows gathered in ways that defied architectural logic. Marcus felt the weight of ages pressing down on him as they approached the meeting place, each step carrying him further from his former life and deeper into conflicts that predated human civilization by millennia. The three ancients revealed themselves as beings so old they seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, their forms shifting between human appearance and something far more primal and terrifying. Their presence warped the lobby's familiar luxury into something alien and threatening, Art Deco eagles appearing to watch with hostile intelligence, while geometric patterns writhed with movement that spoke to geometries beyond human comprehension. Theodore's past betrayal emerged not as simple political maneuvering, but as an attempt to revolutionize vampire law itself, his efforts to protect human-vampire bonds representing challenges to power structures that had existed since before recorded history. The revelation that the ancients hadn't come for Theodore, but for Marcus, transformed the entire confrontation from settling old scores to claiming new assets, supernatural politics that viewed human life as resources to be managed and exploited. Marcus understood his unique position in supernatural law as the first successful blood pact in over 4 centuries, a mystical achievement that represented both breakthrough and threat to powers that controlled relationships between species through fear and isolation. The ancients wanted to study him like a laboratory specimen, their interest in recreating and controlling human-vampire bonds carrying implications that would transform every relationship between the species into instruments of supernatural policy. Theodore's anguish as his past love, Elena was revealed, added personal dimensions to political conflicts, centuries of grief and guilt that explained his protective nature and his determination to prevent history from repeating itself. Constantine realized he had been outmaneuvered from the beginning, his diplomatic approaches rendered irrelevant by ancient powers whose goals extended far beyond territorial control to encompass fundamental changes in supernatural society. The ancients' presence made reality itself seem unstable. Marcus feeling his blood packed burning as they examined him with attention that reduced him from person to phenomenon worthy of scientific investigation. Art Deco patterns throughout the lobby seemed to shift and change as if responding to supernatural energies. Geometric designs taking on organic qualities that suggested life forms operating according to principles beyond human understanding. The eldest ancients' words carried certainty that transformed negotiation into declaration, political maneuvering replaced by statements of fact about outcomes that had already been determined through processes that transcended democratic consultation. Theodore's tactical calculations shifted as he realized the true scope of what they faced. Ancient powers whose interest in Marcus represented opportunities that could reshape supernatural society, regardless of whatever immediate conflicts might emerge from resistance or compliance. The revelation about others like Marcus in the past, who had been used up in experiments, carried implications about the fate awaiting him if the ancients achieved their goals, human life expendable in pursuit of knowledge that would benefit only supernatural communities. The building's architecture seemed to respond to the ancients' presence with subtle changes that made familiar spaces feel foreign and threatening, reality bending around beings whose very existence challenged the stability of physical law. Marcus felt his enhanced abilities responding to the proximity of such ancient power, his blood pact with Theodore, creating resonances that the ancients studied with interest, that transcended mere curiosity to encompass hunger for knowledge that could revolutionize their understanding of cross-species mystical connections. The eldest ancient's smile carried implications that made promises and threats indistinguishable, centuries of accumulated power expressing itself through gestures that could reshape reality according to whims that never considered human preferences or survival. You may keep your territories, Constantine, but the human stays with us. Theodore's past unfolded through flashback sequences that revealed the true scope of his tragedy. Centuries of happiness with Elena destroyed by the same ancient powers now threatening Marcus with identical fate. The blood pact he had achieved with his human love represented a breakthrough that had threatened supernatural power structures, their successful bond proving that relationships between species could transcend the fear and isolation that kept communities separate and controllable. The ancients had killed Elena not from simple cruelty, but from scientific curiosity, their study of her bond with Theodore providing knowledge they had been seeking to replicate and control for centuries. Theodore's rebellion against their authority had been driven by grief that transformed into determination never to allow such tragedy to repeat, his exile the price of defying powers that brooked no challenge to their absolute authority. Present-day Theodore refused to let history repeat itself with Marcus, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations and political necessity as he prepared to challenge forces that had never known defeat. Constantine realized that the ancients planned to overthrow him regardless of whatever agreements might be negotiated, their interest in maintaining existing power structures extending only as far as those structures served their immediate purposes. Theodore's challenge to ancient combat law represented his willingness to sacrifice everything for the chance to give Marcus and Constantine time to escape, honor-compelling actions that rational calculation would reject as futile. The challenge itself carried weight that transcended simple physical confrontation, mystical implications that bound all parties to outcomes determined through combat rather than political maneuvering. Ancient vampire law allowed Theodore's challenge despite his outnumbered position and weakened condition, legal traditions that valued honor above practical considerations or survival instincts. His willingness to face impossible odds echoed his failed protection of Elena, love-compelling sacrifice that logical analysis would condemn as wasteful and ineffective. Marcus understood why Theodore had chosen exile over revenge, recognizing that some principles required defending regardless of personal cost or likelihood of success. Constantine's realization that honor mattered more than power represented a transformation from politician to leader, recognition that some choices defined character in ways that transcended immediate consequences. The flashback sense of Elena's lavender perfume mixed with present fear sweat created sensory experiences that collapsed temporal boundaries, past tragedy and present crisis merging into single moments of absolute clarity about what mattered most. The ancients' forms became less human as they prepared for battle, their ancient nature asserting itself in ways that revealed the true scope of power that Theodore was challenging through formal combat. Theodore's hands remained steady despite impossible odds, centuries of leadership experience maintaining composure even when facing forces that could reshape reality according to their will. The escape route he taught Marcus carried implications about survival that extended beyond simple physical safety to encompass preservation of ideals and relationships that gave meaning to existence itself. Hints about the blood pact granting Marcus more power than anyone realized suggested possibilities that could alter the balance of combat in ways that ancient law had never anticipated. Theodore stepped forward with determination that transformed personal sacrifice into political statement, his challenge representing defiance that could inspire resistance, regardless of whatever immediate outcomes might emerge from ritual combat. I invoke right of combat for the human under my protection. Face me, and let Constantine and the boy leave in peace. Word spread through the supernatural community about Theodore's challenge with speed that spoke to communication networks spanning centuries, representatives arriving to witness combat that could establish precedents affecting relationships between species for generations. Marcus felt his blood pact responding to Theodore's danger, with energies that granted enhanced speed and strength, mystical connections proving more powerful than anyone had anticipated when ancient law met genuine love. Constantine faced his moment of choice between political survival and honor, recognition that some decisions defined character in ways that transcended immediate consequences or rational calculation of advantage. Theodore confronted the first ancient in single combat against an entity that had never known defeat, centuries of accumulated power meeting determination that drew strength from connections transcending individual survival. The blood pact allowed Marcus to share his human life force with Theodore, mystical symbiosis proving more effective than traditional supernatural enhancement techniques developed through millennia of ritual practice. Other supernatural factions debated joining the fight as combat revealed that ancients could be defeated, their absolute authority challenged by powers they had never bothered to understand or respect. The city lights far below provided backdrop for supernatural creatures perching on surrounding buildings, witnesses to confrontation that could reshape hidden society regardless of immediate tactical outcomes. Constantine's moment of moral clarity transformed him from politician calculating advantage to leader accepting responsibility for principles that extended beyond personal or factional interest. Theodore's surprise at his enhanced abilities thanks to Marcus's shared strength demonstrated the power of connections that had developed through friendship rather than mystical compulsion or ancient law. The sound of ancient metal against ancient claws echoed across Manhattan as combat that had been inevitable for centuries finally commenced. Ritual violence that would determine relationships between species through demonstration of relative power rather than diplomatic negotiation. Marcus's human heartbeat, synchronizing with Theodore's inhuman rhythm, created harmonies that resonated through mystical connections neither of them fully understood, love proving more powerful than magical techniques developed across millennia. Marcus recovered enough to continue supporting Theodore through their mystical connection. But each ancient grew stronger as their true nature asserted itself against the constraints of physical reality. Constantine joined the fight with fluid grace that honored ancient law over political expediency, his marble features expressing determination that transformed calculated diplomacy into genuine heroism. Other supernatural creatures began supporting Theodore as inspiration spread through witnesses gathered on surrounding buildings. Their recognition that someone was finally standing for human-vampire bonds, overriding centuries of careful political neutrality. The final ancient revealed the true source of their power as combat reached its crescendo, explaining how they had been feeding off broken blood packs for centuries, sustaining themselves on the spiritual energy released when mystical connections between species were severed through violence or betrayal. Marcus understood that the ancients were weaker than they appeared precisely because their power came from stolen sources rather than genuine connection. Their authority built on fear and isolation rather than the kind of symbiotic relationship he shared with Theodore. The revelation about broken blood pacts transformed the entire confrontation from simple combat to spiritual warfare. Marcus, realizing that every successful connection between human and vampire weakened the ancients' hold on power that depended on keeping the species separate and suspicious. His choice between his own life and Theodore's victory became inevitable as the mystical connection between them demanded everything he could give. Human life force flowing into supernatural combat with intensity that blurred the boundaries between individual survival and collective transformation. Theodore's desperate refusal to lose another human he loved collided with Marcus's determination to choose their relationship over his own safety, love compelling sacrifice that neither of them could prevent, despite understanding its cost. Constantine's moment of heroism emerged from recognition that some principles transcended political calculation. His support for Theodore representing commitment to ideals rather than tactical advantage. The taste of copper and starlight filled Marcus's awareness as he gave Theodore everything, his vision blurring while mystical energies flowed between them with intensity that threatened to burn out human consciousness entirely. Theodore moved with inhuman grace powered by human love, their connection proving more effective than any enhancement technique developed through centuries of supernatural research and ritual practice. The scattered remnants of broken pacts throughout history began resonating in response to their successful bond, spiritual echoes suggesting that healing might be possible for connections that had been thought permanently severed. Marcus felt his life force draining away as Theodore faced the final ancient with power that transcended individual ability, their love creating synergy that ancient law had never anticipated or prepared to counter. The ancients' defeat opened new possibilities for the supernatural world as absolute authority crumbled in the face of genuine connection between species. Political structures built on isolation, proving unable to withstand the reality of successful cooperation. Theodore's victory came at terrible personal cost as Marcus collapsed unconscious, his life force nearly drained by the intensity of sharing power across species boundaries that had never been designed to bear such mystical traffic. Constantine's broken voice asking about Marcus's condition carried weight that acknowledged how completely the confrontation had changed relationships between all supernatural communities, recognition that individual sacrifice had achieved transformation, extending far beyond personal survival. Theodore's response revealed depths of anguish that transcended political victory, his success meaningless if it came at the cost of the human connection that had made resistance possible in the first place. Is he? Constantine asked, as ancient powers crumbled around them and new possibilities emerged from combat that had redefined the relationship between love and authority in supernatural society. I don't know, Theodore replied, his voice breaking with emotion that centuries of imperial training couldn't contain or control. Marcus awakened after weeks in a coma to discover his blood pact fundamentally altered by his sacrifice. Mystical connections now permanent and enhanced in ways that made him something between human and supernatural. Theodore had barely left his bedside during the recovery period, racked with guilt over the cost of victory that had saved supernatural communities, while nearly destroying the relationship that made such salvation meaningful. Constantine reported that the supernatural community was restructuring itself around new principles, human retainers now possessing legal protections that recognized their partnerships with supernatural entities as legitimate relationships rather than simple service contracts. Other blood-pacted humans emerged from hiding throughout the country, inspired by Marcus's example to reveal connections they had kept secret for fear of persecution or exploitation by authorities that had viewed such bonds as aberrations to be eliminated. Marcus discovered his enhanced abilities were now permanent features of his transformed nature, mystical awareness and physical capabilities that made him uniquely qualified to serve as bridge between human and supernatural communities. The changes in his identity required adjustment that went beyond simple acceptance of new abilities, fundamental alterations in how he experienced reality and related to both human and supernatural society. Theodore learned to balance protection with respect for Marcus's autonomy, recognizing that their relationship had evolved beyond simple guardian and protected into genuine partnership between equals who happened to belong to different species. Constantine adapted to leading a more democratic supernatural community, where decisions required consultation with human partners rather than unilateral decrees based on ancient authority and traditional precedent. Relief at Marcus's survival mixed with Theodore's overwhelming gratitude and guilt, emotions that their empathic link transmitted with intensity that made individual feelings indistinguishable from shared experience. Marcus's adjustment to his new capabilities included learning to manage sensory input that encompassed layers of reality invisible to normal human perception, supernatural awareness that revealed the hidden complexity underlying ordinary experience. Sunlight no longer bothered him as much as it had immediately after the blood pact ritual, his enhanced nature providing protection from environmental factors that typically affected humans more severely than supernatural creatures. His ability to sense emotions through the blood pact created intimacy that required both of them to develop new boundaries while maintaining the connection that had proven powerful enough to defeat ancient powers. Theodore's relief manifested as trembling hands that betrayed the depth of fear he had carried during Marcus's unconscious period. Centuries of emotional control cracking under the weight of nearly losing the relationship that had given his existence meaning. Hints about other supernatural communities worldwide watching these changes suggested that their transformation of American vampire society might inspire similar reforms in older, more traditional supernatural societies across the globe. New threats might emerge from the power vacuum created by the ancients' defeat, political instabilities that could prove as dangerous as the absolute authority that had been overthrown through their sacrifice and determination. "You saved me by nearly killing yourself," Marcus said, acknowledging the cost while asserting that their choices had achieved something worth the price they had both paid. "I saved us both," Theodore replied. "There's a difference, recognizing that individual survival meant nothing without the preservation of connections that made existence meaningful rather than merely functional." "What are we now?" Theodore Marcus asked, seeking definition for a relationship that had transcended every category that either human or supernatural society provided for understanding bonds between different species. "We're family," Theodore answered. "Everything else we'll figure out as we go," acknowledging that their connection had created something new that would require invention of entirely original approaches to love and partnership. "I want to go home," Marcus said as strength returned and the medical facility's sterile environment became insufficient for healing that required familiar surroundings and normal routines. "Our home, the university basement," asserting ownership of the space where their friendship had begun and where their transformed relationship would continue developing. Marcus and Theodore resumed their morning coffee ritual 6 months later, but Theodore's official role as Constantine's advisor transformed their basement sanctuary into headquarters for work that bridged human and supernatural communities. Marcus had become a liaison, whose enhanced nature allowed him to translate between species that were learning to cooperate rather than merely coexist in careful isolation. They discussed the growing network of human-vampire partnerships across the country, relationships that were developing models for cooperation that extended far beyond the traditional service contracts that had previously defined interaction between species. A young supernatural creature arrived seeking protection as their first official case, frightened and lost in ways that reminded Marcus of Theodore's initial appearance in the university basement months earlier. Marcus realized this was what he wanted for his transformed life, not a return to his old existence, but a new purpose built from their bond and dedicated to protecting others who were learning to bridge differences that had once seemed insurmountable. The work proved dangerous and never-ending, supernatural politics that required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill that neither of them had possessed when their friendship began with shared coffee and simple conversation. Not all supernatural human relationships developed as healthily as theirs had. Some partnerships requiring intervention and counseling that drew on their experience while respecting the unique circumstances that shaped each individual connection. Contentment in their evolved relationship mixed with satisfaction in meaningful work and excitement about future possibilities that extended far beyond their personal happiness to encompass social change that could benefit both species. The familiar comfort of their morning coffee provided continuity that anchored transformation in routine that honored their origins, while supporting growth that neither of them could have anticipated when Marcus first offered kindness to a lonely old man. Theodore's smile reached his eyes now in ways that had been impossible during his years of exile and careful anonymity. Genuine happiness replacing the guarded gratitude that had characterized his initial acceptance of Marcus's friendship. The bustling activity of their expanded operation filled the basement with purpose that transformed utilitarian space into something resembling a community center where different species could learn to understand and support each other. References to international supernatural communities. Requesting their help suggested that their local success might inspire global changes in how human and supernatural societies related to each other. Hints about Marcus's potential for even greater abilities indicated that his transformation might continue developing in directions that none of them could predict or control, evolution that would require ongoing adaptation and mutual support. "Do you miss it?" Marcus asked as he prepared their morning coffee with movements that had become sacred ritual, connecting past friendship with present partnership. Being normal, acknowledging that his old life had possessed simplicity that their current existence could never reclaim or replicate. "I was never normal," Marcus replied with recognition that had taken months of reflection to achieve. "I just didn't know it yet." Understanding that his capacity for love that transcended species boundaries had always marked him as exceptional, even when he had believed himself ordinary. "Ready for another case?" Theodore asked as footsteps approached their door, his question acknowledging that their work would continue expanding as word spread about their success in bridging differences that had once seemed insurmountable. "With you," Marcus answered as he poured 2 cups of coffee and prepared to greet whoever sought their help. always, asserting commitment that had survived transformation and would continue supporting both their relationship and their mission regardless of whatever challenges might emerge from their growing reputation. The footsteps outside their door carried promise of new opportunities to extend the revolution they had begun. Individual connections between human and supernatural, creating networks of cooperation that could reshape society in ways that political maneuvering alone could never achieve. Sounds like we have company, Marcus said, grinning with anticipation that replaced the fear and uncertainty that had characterized their early encounters with supernatural politics and ancient power. Theodore straightened, not into a ruler reclaiming authority, but into a protector preparing to defend principles that had proven more powerful than empire or tradition, his transformation complete as he prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them. Then let's get to work. Acknowledging that their quiet ritual now fueled activities that could reshape supernatural society, while honoring the simple friendship that had made such transformation possible in the first place. Marcus began his 4:30 a.m. shift in the empty university building, fluorescent lights humming their familiar tune as he descended into the maintenance basement where shadows gathered like old friends waiting to greet him. The building held that peculiar silence of large spaces temporarily abandoned, footsteps echoing through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished faculty whose painted eyes seemed to track his movement through the pre-dawn darkness. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he unlocked the basement door, the metallic taste of instant grounds mixing with the musty smell of old textbooks and forgotten storage rooms that housed decades of academic detritus. Theodore waited by the elevator as always, his frail form seeming to materialize from the shadows, with timing so precise that Marcus had stopped wondering how the old man gained access to a building that remained locked until dawn. The elderly gentleman's paper-thin skin stretched over sharp bones that caught the harsh basement lighting at angles that made his two bright eyes appear to glow with their own inner luminescence. His antique pocket watch gleamed silver against his worn vest as he checked the time with obsessive frequency, movements that carried the precision of someone who had learned to measure existence in carefully counted moments. Theodore accepted Marcus's offered coffee with grateful hands that trembled slightly, their morning ritual having developed over 3 years into something resembling family breakfast shared between unlikely friends. His stories about the old days contained details too specific for casual reminiscence, historical events described with the vivid clarity of personal memory rather than textbook knowledge. When he spoke of debts that compound over centuries, and reckonings that inevitably come due, his voice carried weight that suggested experience rather than mere imagination. Marcus found himself listening with protective attention that had grown stronger over months of shared coffee and conversation, his natural compassion responding to vulnerability that Theodore wore like an ill-fitting mask. The old man's medication bottles bore no labels, their contents dispensed according to schedules that followed no medical logic Marcus could discern. Yet Theodore's hands never hesitated when selecting pills whose purposes remained mysteriously undefined. His formal speech patterns carried traces of accent that seemed to shift and change, depending on which historical period his stories happened to reference. Linguistic evolution captured in vocal patterns that suggested centuries of accumulated experience. Theodore mentioned waiting for someone with the patience of someone accustomed to delays, measured in decades rather than minutes. His pocket watch consultation becoming more frequent as their conversation continued through the pre-dawn darkness. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made Theodore's features appear alternately ancient and timeless, his sharp cheekbones catching illumination in ways that suggested bone structure designed for purposes other than purely human anatomy. Marcus offered food from his lunch with instinctive generosity that had characterized their friendship from its beginning, simple kindness that had bridged whatever gaps existed between their vastly different life experiences. Theodore's acceptance carried gratitude that went beyond simple appreciation for shared meals, emotional depth that suggested loneliness extending far beyond the ordinary isolation that might afflict elderly individuals living alone in urban environments. His references to ancient obligations and mystical debts wove through ordinary conversation with casualness that made supernatural concepts seem as mundane as weather reports or traffic updates. The basement's utilitarian environment transformed during their morning ritual into something approaching sacred space, friendship creating warmth that had nothing to do with the building's heating system or the steam rising from their coffee cups. Theodore's grateful but guarded acceptance of Marcus's kindness suggested someone unaccustomed to generosity, offered without expectation of return or hidden agenda, vulnerability that made their developing bond feel both precious and fragile. When he spoke of waiting for someone, his voice carried certainty that suggested appointment rather than hope. Mystical confidence that transcended ordinary expectations about human scheduling and social convention. The pocket watch consultation grew more obsessive as their conversation continued, ancient timepiece serving purposes that went beyond simple chronometry to encompass awareness of forces that operated according to schedules invisible to normal human perception. Marcus's protective instincts responded to Theodore's combination of frailty and hidden strength, recognizing someone who needed care while suspecting that appearances might not reflect the complete truth about his companion's actual nature or capabilities. Their friendship had developed through daily repetition of small kindnesses, coffee shared, and stories exchanged, creating intimacy that neither of them had anticipated when Marcus first noticed an old man waiting alone in the basement's shadows. Theodore's too specific historical knowledge suggested either exceptional education or personal experience with events that predated his apparent age by decades or possibly centuries. Temporal contradictions that Marcus had learned to accept without demanding explanations. His sharp, too bright eyes seemed to perceive layers of reality that remained invisible to normal human awareness, supernatural perception that manifested as uncanny ability to anticipate events before they occurred through ordinary causation. The basement's familiar environment felt charged with potential as Theodore's stories grew more cryptic and his pocket watch consultations became increasingly urgent, routine disrupted by forces that had been building toward revelation for longer than Marcus could possibly imagine. Theodore froze mid-sentence during a story about political maneuvering in 19th-century European courts, his body going rigid with attention, focused on sounds that Marcus's human hearing couldn't detect or identify. The old man's transformation from frail storyteller to alert sentinel happened so quickly that it seemed to involve fundamental changes in his essential nature rather than simple shifts in posture or expression. His whispered words carried certainty that transcended fear to encompass recognition of inevitability that had been anticipated for years of careful hiding and strategic anonymity. "They've found me," he said, voice containing layers of meaning that spoke to pursuit and discovery, ancient conflicts finally reaching resolution through confrontation that could no longer be avoided or postponed. Heavy footsteps echoed through the building's upper levels, with precision that suggested military training and coordination. Multiple individuals moving with purpose that transcended ordinary human business or casual building access. The sound carried weight that made the basement's ceiling seem fragile protection against forces that operated according to rules Marcus had never imagined or considered possible. 4 imposing bodyguards in dark suits swept through the entrance with fluid coordination that spoke to supernatural rather than merely human enhancement, their movements creating temperature drops that had nothing to do with air conditioning or seasonal weather patterns. Their presence seemed to bend shadows toward them in ways that defied architectural logic. Darkness responding to their proximity, as if recognizing kindred essence that transcended ordinary interaction between light and physical obstruction. The Vampire King entered behind his guards with authority that filled the university lobby like presence rather than mere occupation of space, tall and pale with features that carried the weight of centuries rather than decades of accumulated power and responsibility. His very existence challenged Marcus's understanding of reality, while Theodore straightened in response, frailty falling away like discarded costume to reveal strength that had been hidden beneath carefully maintained appearances. The temperature drop that accompanied the vampire's entrance created visible breath that spoke to supernatural rather than natural causes, mystical energies manifesting as environmental changes that normal physics couldn't explain or predict. Shadows bent toward the newcomers with movement that suggested conscious response rather than passive reaction to light source manipulation. Darkness recognizing beings whose essential nature transcended ordinary interaction with physical reality. Theodore's voice gained resonance and command as his true nature asserted itself against years of careful concealment, imperial authority emerging from beneath the mask of vulnerable elderly gentlemen that had protected his identity during years of strategic exile. The vampire king and his guards knelt before Theodore with ceremony that spoke to recognition of superior rank within hierarchies that Marcus had never suspected existed, supernatural protocol that transformed his morning coffee companion into figure of ultimate authority. "Your Majesty," the vampire king said to Theodore, words carrying weight that redefined every assumption Marcus had made about their friendship and Theodore's actual identity within systems of power that operated beyond human awareness or understanding. "Rise, Constantine," Theodore replied with voice that commanded rather than requested. "We have much to discuss and little time." Acknowledgement that their morning coffee ritual had been permanently disrupted by forces that would reshape both their lives in ways neither of them could control or predict. Constantine's eyes found Marcus with assessment that carried implications about human knowledge of supernatural secrets, recognition that ordinary mortal had become witness to revelation that typically resulted in memory modification or more permanent solutions to security breaches. Theodore's protective gesture toward Marcus spoke to bonds that transcended political necessity or strategic consideration. Friendship that had achieved importance greater than whatever diplomatic advantages might be gained through sacrifice of human companion to supernatural expedience. The university lobby's familiar architecture seemed inadequate to contain the weight of ancient powers and political implications that had transformed morning routine into confrontation with forces that operated according to rules predating human civilization by millennia. Marcus found himself caught between his human understanding of reality and supernatural hierarchy, that his worldview had no framework for processing or accepting. Ordinary existence shattered by revelation that friendship had been built on foundations he couldn't have imagined. Theodore turned to Marcus with expression that mixed affection with regret. Recognition that their quiet morning ritual must evolve to accommodate responsibilities and dangers that could no longer be avoided through careful anonymity or strategic concealment. "My dear friend, I'm afraid our morning coffee ritual must evolve." Acknowledgement that transformation had begun, which would either strengthen their bond beyond anything human experience typically encompassed, or destroy it through forces that neither friendship nor good intentions could overcome. Marcus stared at the basement conference room, transformed into a war council by the presence of beings whose very existence challenged everything he thought he understood about reality and power structures that operated beyond human awareness. Theodore revealed his true identity as former vampire emperor Theodoric, with voice that carried centuries of accumulated authority, imperial bearing, emerging from beneath the careful mask of frail elderly gentlemen that had protected his anonymity during 3 years of strategic exile from supernatural politics. Constantine explained the approaching threat with urgency that transcended diplomatic courtesy. Ancient vampires from the Old Country, crossing oceanic boundaries to reclaim American territories they considered rightfully theirs, according to laws predating human colonization by millennia of supernatural occupation and blood-soaked conquest. Marcus learned he had been Theodore's only human contact during years of exile. Their morning coffee ritual, representing the former emperor's sole anchor to humanity and connection to the mortal world that had sustained him through isolation, that would have driven lesser beings to madness or despair. Theodore agreed to help Constantine face the coming threat, but only if Marcus received protected status within supernatural law. Their friendship having achieved importance that transcended whatever strategic advantages might be gained through human sacrifice to political expedience or diplomatic necessity. Constantine's advisors argued Marcus represented a security risk, whose knowledge of vampire politics could compromise operations that required absolute secrecy. Their concerns about human reliability reflecting centuries of experience with mortal betrayal and the inherent instability of beings whose lifespans made them poor candidates for long-term strategic planning. Theodore refused to negotiate without guaranteed protection for Marcus, former imperial authority asserting itself against current political leadership with determination that brooked no compromise or alternative arrangement. "The boy stays, or you face the ancients without my knowledge of their weaknesses," Theodore declared with voice that commanded rather than requested. Imperial decree that carried weight transcending diplomatic protocol or contemporary political hierarchy. "I'm not a boy, and I can make my own choices," Marcus replied with courage that surprised even himself. Human autonomy asserting itself against supernatural paternalism that treated mortal agency as irrelevant consideration in conflicts that predated human civilization. The musty basement atmosphere transformed into something resembling a military command center as vampire politics invaded the utilitarian space that had served as sanctuary for their developing friendship over years of shared coffee and quiet conversation. Vampire scents of old leather and metal filled air that had previously carried only mundane odors of forgotten textbooks and institutional cleaning supplies, supernatural presence manifesting as sensory changes that spoke to the fundamental alteration of familiar environment. Marcus's human heartbeat sounded loud in supernatural silence that fell between statements of position and declarations of intent, mortality made audible among beings whose existence transcended ordinary temporal limitations and biological necessities. Constantine's advisors discussed blood-pact rituals that could provide Marcus with supernatural protection while binding his life force to Theodore's continued existence, mystical connection that would either save or doom both participants, depending on circumstances, neither of them could control or predict. Theodore's past sins that had led to his exile remained unspecified, but clearly involved violations of ancient law serious enough to warrant permanent banishment from positions of authority within vampire society, political crimes that had transformed Emperor into anonymous fugitive seeking refuge in human anonymity. The weight of secrets Marcus must now carry pressed against his consciousness with burden that spoke to the fundamental impossibility of returning to his previous existence of comfortable ignorance about supernatural realities that shaped human history through manipulation and control, extending across centuries of carefully hidden influence. Constantine finally agreed to protect Marcus, but warned that the ancients showed no mercy to humans who discovered vampire secrets. Their enforcement of supernatural law, extending to elimination of mortal witnesses, whose knowledge threatened carefully maintained separation between species that shared the same world while inhabiting completely different realities. Theodore showed Marcus his true living space above an antique shop, centuries of artifacts and memories creating museum of vampire history that spoke to longevity that encompassed the rise and fall of human civilizations, while supernatural society maintained continuity through adaptation and careful concealment. Ancient books crumbled at Marcus's human touch, physical contact with mortality proving destructive to materials that had survived centuries of vampire handling. The fundamental incompatibility between human and supernatural existence made manifest through simple interaction with preserved knowledge. Marcus learned about vampire hierarchy and the concept of blood debts that created obligations transcending individual death, mystical connections that bound vampire society together through networks of reciprocal responsibility that could extend across centuries of accumulated obligation and inherited duty. Theodore began teaching Marcus basic supernatural survival skills, while time pressure mounted as intelligence networks reported ancient vampire forces gathering in preparation for territorial reclamation that would reshape American supernatural society according to old country traditions that recognized no accommodation with human society or modern political structures. You ruled them for how long, Marcus asked, as the scope of Theodore's former authority became clear through artifacts and documentation that spoke to power extending across continents and centuries of absolute dominion over vampire society. 6 centuries, Theodore replied with voice heavy with regret. And I failed them in the end. Acknowledgement that imperial responsibility had been abandoned through choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but had proven inadequate to protect those who had depended on his leadership and protection. But you're here now, Marcus observed with optimism that spoke to his fundamental faith in redemption and second chances. That has to count for something, human perspective that valued present commitment over past failure, moral framework that offered forgiveness that vampire society's harsh justice typically denied to those who violated ancient law. Theodore's inhuman grace when he thought Marcus wasn't watching revealed physical capabilities that had been carefully concealed during their months of friendship. Supernatural nature manifesting in movements that transcended human limitation, while maintaining the illusion of frail mortality that had protected his identity during years of strategic anonymity. The weight of a silver blade, Theodore insisted Marcus carry, spoke to dangers that required preparation for violence that his previous existence as university janitor had never contemplated or required. Weapons training that acknowledged the fundamental transformation of his circumstances from safe routine to deadly supernatural politics. Other human retainers who served vampire houses provided precedent for Marcus's situation, while highlighting the risks inherent in close association with beings whose priorities and moral frameworks operated according to principles that valued supernatural society's stability over individual human survival or happiness. The concept of a blood pact that would bind Marcus to Theodore's protection offered mystical connection that could either save his life or condemn both participants to shared destruction depending on circumstances that neither friendship nor good intentions could control or predict. Theodore received a message written in blood as their conversation continued, ancient communication methods that spoke to the formal challenge that had been building toward confrontation through months of careful maneuvering and diplomatic positioning that was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. The ancients request an audience. The message read with ceremonial language that carried implications about supernatural protocol and ancient law that governed conflicts between beings whose power transcended anything Marcus had imagined possible. Sunset. The message continued with timing that spoke to vampire nature and the mystical significance of transitional moments between day and night when supernatural energies reached peak intensity. Come alone. The final instruction that challenged Theodore's commitment to protecting Marcus while demanding compliance with terms that offered no guarantee of survival for either participant in whatever confrontation awaited them at the designated meeting place. Marcus stood in Constantine's repurposed cathedral stronghold as late afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows that cast rainbow shadows across ancient stone floors, where Theodore insisted on the blood pact ritual before facing the ancients whose power had drawn supernatural creatures from across the continental United States to witness whatever resolution awaited 3 years of careful maneuvering and diplomatic positioning. The ceremonial blades gleamed silver against Constantine's altar as Marcus underwent the ceremony that would bind his life force to Theodore's protection through mystical connection that transcended ordinary human understanding of biology and physics. Ancient magic manifesting as shared blood that tasted of copper and starlight, while creating empathic links that would either save or destroy both participants, depending on circumstances neither friendship nor strategic planning could control. The ritual gave Marcus limited supernatural awareness that made previously invisible layers of reality suddenly accessible to his enhanced perception, while simultaneously making him detectable to other vampires whose supernatural senses could now identify his transformed essence from distances that rendered anonymity impossible and concealment futile. "This will change you forever," Theodore warned, as the silver blade approached Marcus's palm with ceremony that spoke to irreversible transformation of his essential nature from purely human to something that existed between mortal and supernatural realms. "So did meeting you," Marcus replied with trust that transcended fear, acknowledgement that their friendship had already fundamentally altered the trajectory of his existence in ways that made additional change seem like natural progression rather than terrifying leap into unknown territory. "Let's do it." Acceptance that spoke to his willingness to embrace whatever consequences might follow, from choices made in loyalty and love rather than careful calculation of personal advantage or safety. "The pact is sealed," Theodore declared as their blood mingled on ancient stone, mystical energies creating bonds that would endure beyond individual death, while transforming Marcus into something unprecedented in vampire law, human who retained his essential mortality while gaining supernatural protection through connection that made him visible to every mystical creature within hundreds of miles of their location. As the ritual concluded, Marcus gasped at sudden awareness of supernatural presences throughout New York City. Enhanced perception, revealing the true scope of hidden society that had operated alongside human civilization for centuries without detection by mortal awareness, that lacked the mystical sensitivity necessary to perceive beings whose existence challenged everything ordinary humans believed about the nature of reality. "There are so many of them," he whispered with voice that carried wonder and terror in equal measure. "They're everywhere." Acknowledgement that his world had expanded beyond anything his previous experience as university janitor could have prepared him to understand or accept, transformation that made return to normal existence impossible, while opening possibilities he had never imagined could exist. Marcus struggled with enhanced senses that made supernatural creatures throughout Manhattan visible to his transformed perception. Werewolf packs and fae courts and witch covens, all responding to the ancients' presence with mobilization that spoke to continent-wide political implications, extending far beyond simple territorial dispute between vampire factions. Constantine's network reported supernatural community dividing into factions, with some seeking appeasement of ancient authority, while others prepared for war that could expose hidden society to human awareness, political crisis that threatened carefully maintained separation between species that shared the same world while inhabiting fundamentally different realities. Theodore prepared for confrontation while trying to shield Marcus from the worst emotional impacts of their empathic connection. Former emperors' centuries of accumulated grief and guilt threatening to overwhelm human consciousness that lacked supernatural resilience necessary to process the weight of immortal memory and regret. The ancients sent an emissary in the form of a child vampire whose apparent innocence masked centuries of accumulated malice. Too sweet scent of old blood and forgotten flowers, announcing presence that defied ordinary assumptions about the relationship between physical appearance and actual age or power. The ancients offer terms Constantine reported with voice that carried the weight of impossible choices. "Surrender the traitor Theodore, and your territory remains yours." Diplomatic solution that would preserve current power structures while sacrificing the one being whose knowledge might be essential to surviving whatever larger conflict was approaching from across oceanic boundaries. Counteroffer. Theodore replied with imperial authority that had been hidden beneath years of careful anonymity. "They can meet us at sunset, or we come to them at midnight. challenge that spoke to ancient law and ritual combat that predated contemporary political structures by millennia of supernatural tradition and precedent. The city's supernatural layer became visible to Marcus through his enhanced awareness, shadows that moved wrong, and reflections that didn't match ordinary physics, revealing the true scope of hidden society that had operated alongside human civilization while maintaining absolute secrecy through methods that combined mystical concealment with ruthless elimination of witnesses whose knowledge threatened carefully maintained separation between species. The child vampire's unsettling blend of innocence and ancient malice spoke to the fundamental corruption of natural order that vampire existence represented. Eternal youth purchased through predation that transformed beings who might once have been purely human into creatures whose moral framework operated according to principles that valued supernatural society's stability over individual suffering or justice. References to Theodore's great betrayal that had led to his exile suggested violations of vampire law serious enough to warrant permanent banishment from positions of authority, political crimes that had transformed emperor into fugitive while creating enemies whose pursuit had finally succeeded after years of careful investigation and patient tracking. The child vampire looked directly at Marcus with assessment that spoke to intelligence reports and strategic planning that had identified him as target, rather than mere collateral damage. Supernatural awareness that made their friendship into weapon that could be used against Theodore's resistance to ancient authority. The ancients are curious about your pet human Theodoric, the child announced with voice that carried centuries of accumulated cruelty beneath appearance of childhood innocence. Mystical perception that had identified Marcus as key to understanding whatever larger purpose had driven ancient vampires to cross oceanic boundaries in pursuit of goals that transcended simple territorial reclamation. They have such interesting plans for him, threat that spoke to experimental interest in the first successful blood pact ritual in over 400 years of vampire history. Scientific curiosity about human-vampire bonds that could justify any amount of suffering inflicted in pursuit of knowledge that might reshape supernatural society according to ancient preferences and priorities. Theodore, Constantine, and Marcus arrived at the Chrysler Building as sunset painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate backdrop for confrontation that would either resolve 3 years of careful maneuvering through diplomatic channels or escalate into open warfare that could expose supernatural society to human awareness through violence that urban populations couldn't ignore or rationalize. The Art Deco lobby had been transformed into supernatural court with architectural details that seemed designed for purposes other than human occupation. Eagles and geometric patterns that watched with hostile intelligence as ancient powers prepared to demonstrate why they had ruled vampire society for millennia, before Theodore's rebellion had temporarily disrupted their absolute authority. The three ancients revealed themselves as being so old they predated recorded history, entities whose power warped reality around them in ways that made ordinary physical laws seem like suggestions rather than immutable principles governing the behavior of matter and energy in space and time. They exposed Theodore's betrayal with ceremony that spoke to formal accusations and legal proceedings that followed vampire law's harsh justice. Revelation that he had fallen in love with a human centuries ago and attempted to change supernatural society's fundamental prohibitions against bonds between species whose essential natures were incompatible according to ancient wisdom and accumulated experience. "You thought we came for the exile," the eldest ancient declared, with voice that carried the weight of geological epochs. Power that made human civilization seem like momentary disturbance in patterns that extended across millennia of vampire dominance and supernatural control. "We came for the miracle he created." Acknowledgement that Marcus represented achievement, that ancient vampires had thought permanently lost, through centuries of failed experimentation and disappointed hope. "The boy has achieved what we thought lost forever," Recognition that the blood pact represented breakthrough in understanding of human-vampire symbiosis that could reshape supernatural society if properly studied and controlled through methods that would undoubtedly prove fatal to the human test subject, whose survival was irrelevant consideration compared to knowledge that might be gained. The ancient's presence made Art Deco eagles seem to watch with hostile awareness, while Marcus felt his blood pact burning as ancient powers examined the mystical connection that bound his life force to Theodore's protection, supernatural scrutiny that revealed the unprecedented nature of their bond, while identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited for purposes that transcended simple territorial dispute. You may keep your territories. Constantine the eldest ancient offered with magnanimity that spoke to the fundamental irrelevance of contemporary political structures compared to scientific opportunity that Marcus represented, diplomatic concession that revealed the true purpose behind ancient intervention in American vampire affairs. But the human stays with us, demand that transformed negotiation into ultimatum, while making clear that Marcus had always been the primary target, rather than collateral damage in conflicts between vampire factions whose territorial disputes were secondary considerations compared to experimental possibilities that his unique nature represented.